Tonight, we begin with a revelation that military commanders had feared, suppressed, and desperately tried to contain. A story that unfolded not over months of careful investigation, but in a matter of hours. Hours that shattered the carefully constructed narrative being fed to the public. Hours that expose the gap between what you're being told and what is actually happening on the ground. Hours that may change the way you understand every conflict report you've ever read. What the frontline soldiers revealed this week crossed a line that the media establishment had hoped would hold. And when that line broke, the men and women who had lived through it did not hesitate. They spoke with clarity, with courage, and with a precision born from experience that no analyst sitting behind a studio desk could ever replicate. For months now, there had been whispers, not from official briefings, not from Pentagon press conferences, just whispers that something was deeply wrong with the way the ground war was being reported. The soldiers had been watching, yes, but they had been watching in silence. A disciplined, trained, and deeply frustrated silence. Their accounts followed a certain pattern, a rhythm of observation, a near clockwork consistency of experience. But what set off alarm bells among veterans networks and independent journalists this week was that the silence broke. Analysts who monitor frontline communication and soldier testimony know the indicators. The sudden surge in anonymous posts from active duty personnel, the coded language shifting to plain speech, the uptick in soldiers requesting early discharge or transfers, the sudden flood of footage that contradicted every official report from the same coordinates, all of that, every signal converged at once. And whenever soldiers who have been trained to stay quiet start talking, it means something they witnessed can no longer be left unsaid. Early this week, independent journalists and open source intelligence analysts detected what they described as a coordinated pattern of testimony, including firsthand accounts that had not been corroborated or permitted in over 2 years of active conflict. These are the kinds of accounts that frontline soldiers only share when they are signaling something very specific, that the official version is false, that the human cost is being hidden, or that decisions are being made at a command level that the public has not been given the information to evaluate. Observers didn't know which category these revelations fell into, or whether they fell into all three simultaneously. But what they did know was that the soldiers on the ground were changing posture. They were stepping outside the chain of silence. And when people who have sworn oaths and accepted extraordinary personal risk begin speaking without authorization, even by a single soldier, the people paying attention understand something has gone profoundly wrong in the relationship between the truth and the camera. The accounts pouring out of the front line this week were not rumors, they were not complaints, they were not political statements, they were documentation, source after source, soldiers who had served in the most active combat zones, medics who had treated the wounded, logistics officers who had moved through territory the cameras never reached, described what they had witnessed as deliberately misrepresented, strategically excluded from broadcast, and perhaps most critically sanitized to a degree that had made the public genuinely incapable of understanding what a modern ground war actually costs. But sanitizing a war only works if the soldiers stay silent. These soldiers did not. In fact, their response this week was among the most coordinated and credible whistleblower moments we have seen in the history of modern conflict journalism. Here is what we now know. Within days of the first account surfacing, dozens more soldiers came forward. These weren't vague complaints about morale. These were specific, detailed, time-stamped accounts, testimonies that came with photographs, coordinates, and medical records that no news organization had yet touched, because no news organization had yet been willing to ask. This week, multiple sources confirmed that frontline units had been operating in conditions that were never disclosed to the public, including forward positions that had recently been redesignated as cleared for what military planners believed was operational convenience, not tactical reality. Soldiers documented what the cameras missed before the official narrative could be reinforced. They captured footage of supply lines that had broken down. They described casualty figures that did not match the numbers being released. They recorded the medical situations of wounded soldiers who were being classified in ways that removed them from official casualty counts. In other words, soldiers were documenting the infrastructure of deception, the logistical and bureaucratic machinery that made the official story possible while the real story rotted beneath it. This is what made the independent analysts' concern so urgent. The gap between the briefed version and the lived version wasn't just symbolic. It was systemic. It represented the kind of institutionalized misrepresentation that compounds itself over time until the public is making policy-level judgments based on information that bears almost no resemblance to the actual situation on the ground. And these soldiers, understanding that fully, responded with testimony, not recklessly, not impulsively, but with the structured, deliberate precision of people who had spent years learning how to document operational reality. They didn't fabricate grievance. They didn't exaggerate for effect. They described what they saw. They described what they carried. And they described what they were told to pretend they hadn't seen. And here is where the story becomes even more disturbing. Intelligence analysts now believe that the gap between official reports and frontline reality had been deliberately calibrated, designed to test the tolerance of a public that had been conditioned over many years to accept a certain level of abstraction when it came to ground warfare. The question being asked behind closed doors was whether the public would demand more or whether the more comfortable version would hold. But instead, the opposite happened. The soldiers didn't accept the compact of silence. They pushed back with testimony so detailed, so corroborated, so consistent across multiple theaters and multiple ranks that even the most skeptical journalists were forced to take it seriously. You don't easily get uniformed personnel, trained from day one in operational security and institutional loyalty, to break ranks at scale. But this week, they did. A former intelligence officer speaking with independent media under anonymity described the behavior of the official press apparatus as managed perception architecture, a way of constructing public understanding that prioritizes political sustainability over factual accuracy. But the soldiers proved this week that they remain both conscious and articulate. Their accounts were not only credible, they were structured so precisely that the internal contradictions they exposed could be independently verified against satellite imagery, hospital records, and the testimony of local civilians. That specificity matters because it shows something critical. These soldiers are not disgruntled outliers. They are representatives of a frontline experience that has been systematically excluded from the public record. They are not passive recipients of a narrative being handed down to them. They are active witnesses who understand the difference between what they were told to report and what they actually encountered. As reports continued coming in throughout the week, we learned more about the scale of what has been hidden. Infantry units had been conducting repeated engagements in zones classified as stabilized, forcing soldiers into a position where their actual operational reality was legally invisible in official reporting. Medical personnel stationed at forward surgical units described casualty patterns that had been deliberately fragmented across administrative categories. Injuries classified in ways that kept them off the primary casualty dashboards being fed to the media. Logistics officers operating deep inside supply chains that the cameras never reach reportedly documented the systematic diversion of resources, aid, equipment, and critical medical supplies being redirected away from the points of highest need toward locations that were more convenient for photographic access. This wasn't just poor communication. This wasn't just bureaucratic inefficiency. This was the construction of a parallel reality. This was the industrial scale management of public perception. And perception management is the one thing modern military communications have struggled to maintain with integrity since the advent of the smartphone. For every carefully composed press release they have issued, frontline soldiers have countered with footage that breaks the frame entirely. Remember, the architects of official war narratives thought that embedding journalists would create accountability. They thought that social media would be too fragmented to produce coherent counter-narratives. They thought that soldiers, bound by oath and discipline, would maintain the silence that made clean, palatable reporting possible. But tonight, the exact opposite is happening. Soldiers are speaking in organized, documented testimony. The counter-narrative is more coherent than the official one. And the oath that was supposed to ensure silence has been reinterpreted by the soldiers themselves as an oath to truth that supersedes the one to institutional reputation. What makes this moment so significant, and so politically dangerous, is that these revelations are emerging at a time when military leadership is under extraordinary pressure from multiple directions. Hawks want escalation justified. Peace advocates want de-escalation confirmed. Politicians want narratives that survive the next election cycle. Families want to know what is actually happening to their sons and daughters. Military leadership is attempting to balance these competing demands while simultaneously managing an active conflict whose daily reality resists every form of simplification. And when institutions in that position make sudden moves to suppress testimony, they are not acting from confidence. They are acting from exposure. They are acting from the creeping recognition that the story they have been telling is fracturing, and that the people best positioned to break it open are the very people they sent into the field. The official response issued by military communications offices this week was not measured, it was not confident, it was not transparent, it was defensive. Spokesperson after spokesperson, in briefing after briefing, described the soldiers' accounts as inconsistent with documented operational realities. That is bureaucratic language for, we don't want you to believe what the people who were actually there are telling you. You don't usually hear that kind of categorical dismissal from institutional communications unless the testimony being dismissed is dangerously close to something that cannot be explained away. Meanwhile, the soldiers themselves, in video testimonies, written accounts, and interviews conducted through secure channels, addressed the public directly in statements that were neither rehearsed nor polished. One soldier said, "We were told the area was clear. We walked into contact within 10 minutes. The report the next morning said no engagements." Another said, "I treated 7 men in a 6-hour period. Officially, that day had 0 casualties. I still have the bandages." And another said, "I'm not doing this for politics. I'm doing this because my friends deserve to have their experience acknowledged." These are not rhetorical flourishes. These are statements from human beings who understand with the clarity that only proximity to death provides just how high the stakes of an honest account have become, not just for policy, but for the next generation of soldiers who will be sent into the next war on the basis of whatever lessons the public draws from this one. Here is what makes the situation even more significant. The soldiers' accounts were not isolated to a single front or a single unit. Along with the infantry testimony, medical personnel from multiple forward units also reported discrepancies in how wounded soldiers were being processed administratively. Logistics coordinators described systematic misalignment between declared supply routes and actual delivery records. And communication officers reported being explicitly instructed on which categories of incident were to be excluded from the public-facing daily briefings. All of this emerged within the same 48-hour window. When multiple categories of frontline personnel produce consistent accounts simultaneously, it does not indicate coordination for political effect. It indicates that the reality they are describing is sufficiently universal that independent witnesses arrived at the same conclusions without needing to compare notes. Analysts are now considering several possibilities about what happens next. One is that military institutions will move to aggressively suppress further testimony through formal legal channels, using the structures of operational security law to criminalize disclosure. Another is that individual commands will attempt to discredit the specific soldiers who have come forward, examining their records for anything that can be used to reframe their testimony as grievance rather than documentation. A third possibility, the one worrying independent journalists and civil liberties observers the most, is that the sheer volume of testimony will make suppression impossible and that the institutional response will shift from denial to reframing, accepting that some version of the soldier's reality is true while constructing a narrative that absorbs it without producing accountability. But this week, the soldiers took one card off the table. They didn't wait for permission. They didn't wait for institutional support. They didn't wait for a single outlet with the courage to carry the full story, unedited. They spoke directly on the record with the kind of specificity that makes categorical dismissal impossible. What we are watching now is a test of institutional credibility. The military communications apparatus wants to see whether the public will defer to official classifications over first-hand testimony. The soldiers want to demonstrate that the public's right to understand what is being done in its name cannot be permanently subordinated to the institutional preference for a clean narrative. The media establishment wants to prevent the emergence of a precedent in which soldiers bypass official channels to reach the public directly, because that precedent threatens the access arrangements on which embedded journalism depends. And civil society wants to prevent a situation in which the next generation of soldiers enters combat without the public having been given an honest account of what the previous generation actually experienced. Tonight, we have heard from independent researchers who are now cross-referencing the soldiers' accounts with publicly available satellite imagery, hospital admission records from border facilities, and testimony from local civilian populations in the affected zones. They say the corroboration rate is higher than in any comparable whistleblower event in recent military history. They say the internal consistency of the accounts across rank, specialty, and geographic assignment suggests not coordination, but shared experience of conditions that were uniformly different from what was being officially described. And they say the soldiers' decision to speak is likely part of a broader recognition that the gap between the lived reality of modern ground warfare and the public understanding of it has become so large that it represents in itself a form of institutional danger. Because wars fought on the basis of misunderstood realities produce strategies that fail, policies that repeat mistakes, and casualty figures that are never honestly mourned. But the soldiers who have come forward are not defeated by this recognition. In fact, they appear energized by it. Their response this week, organized, specific, and morally grounded, sent a message to the media establishment that credibility cannot be manufactured in the long run if it is not earned on the ground. And it sent a message to the public that the information you are being given about ground warfare is a curated selection, and that the curators have interests that are not identical to yours. As the days ahead unfold, we expect more testimony to emerge about what exactly happened in the specific engagements these soldiers described, and what institutional decisions were made in the hours and days after those engagements to determine what the public would and would not be told. But what we do know is that the soldiers' decision to speak was timely. It came before the official narrative had fully calcified. It came with enough corroborating detail to resist the standard mechanisms of institutional dismissal. And it came from people whose credibility rests not on political position or ideological alignment, but on the simple and irreducible fact that they were there and you were not. What happens next will depend on what the institutions do in the coming weeks. If they engage honestly, if they open the records, examine the discrepancies, and allow an honest accounting, this moment will be remembered as the point at which the relationship between military institutions and the public they serve was renegotiated on more honest terms. If they suppress, deflect, and discredit, the soldiers who have already spoken have made clear they are ready to continue. They have shown they are willing to carry the weight of institutional disapproval in exchange for the possibility that the public will finally understand what a ground war actually looks like from the inside. And tonight, for the first time in the long-managed history of modern war reporting, the people doing the fighting appear to have found their collective voice. The official channels are quiet, notably quiet, and when institutions that normally produce a daily flood of press releases, briefings, and coordinated messaging go quiet, it means they are recalibrating. It means they are choosing their next move carefully, because tonight the military communications apparatus learned something it has perhaps always known, but hoped would never be tested at scale. Soldiers remember everything. The camera may be controlled, but the memory is not, and the public, given the choice between a polished narrative and a first-hand account, is more capable of handling the truth than any communication strategy has ever given it credit for. This story is far from over. But tonight, one thing is clear. The front line is no longer just a geographic location. It is the boundary between what is being said and what is true. The soldiers who crossed it this week did so without weapons, without orders, and without the protection of institutional backing. And the ground they took in the form of public attention and documented testimony will not be easily retaken. We will be here watching every detail as the next phase of this reckoning unfolds.